Super excited about this next session. We're talking about how to align your workforce digital transformation and your employee experience strategies. We've got some amazing panelists that are going to be joining us. We're joined by Bennun, who's the Vice President of Employee Experience at DAZN. We've got Cezary, Maczka, former CHRO and Chief Innovation Officer at Budimex. We've got Nancy Estell-Zoder, Vice President of Product Strategy at Oracle. Mark Howarth, who's the Vice President of HR and Employee Experience at Capgemini. And last but certainly not least, we've got Joseph Rock, who's the Group Head of People Experiences and Chief Operating Officer at ABSA Africa. Welcome, everyone. How are you all?
Amazing.
Good. Very good. Thanks.
I don't think you could ever solve that awkward moment on a Zoom call when everyone says, how are you? Have any of you solved how that is? How you do that? Where it's like, who goes first? Do I say anything? I feel like I haven't solved that yet as well. But Joseph, we said backstage we're going to pick on you first, so I have to live up to that promise. What do leaders need to consider when they're planning for this change in the workforce expectations when we talk about personalized work experience, employee experience? Because it's kind of taken on a whole new meaning over the last 2 years.
Look, I think it's a great question, Chris, and afternoon, everyone. Don't know what time it is. It's afternoon where I am, so joining you from a cold Johannesburg in South Africa, believe it or not. But there's a couple of things, Chris. I think, one of the biggest challenges, I guess, facing leaders today is about improving that lived workplace experience for their employees so that their organizations can actually attract and retain world-class talent, right? That's what we're all trying to do at the moment. But the reality is that today's workers are getting younger, right? We know that. And then they're used now to sharing information all over, very transparent about that, having access. They want slick, always on, personalized type experiences. And they're very demanding, unfortunately. They are very demanding. And so just the way they live now in their personal lives, that's actually what they expect in the workspace. They want an integrated, personalized digital experience, which specifically focuses on facilitating collaboration for them. They want it to be empowering them individually. They want 24/7 access, and they want things instantly. That's what we need to bear in mind. And so I think as the younger generations start to represent larger segments of the workforce, and whilst we're all trying to adapt to our new normals post-COVID, employees are also wanting these digital experiences to be coupled with greater focus on things like employee well-being, their career growth, as well as social impact. So we mustn't lose sight of some of the other stuff that they're asking for, I think. I think for us as HR leaders, what for me is crucially important is that we must absolutely now abandon the one-size-fits-all approach that I think many of us probably have been guilty of in the past. We have to ensure that our employee experience efforts target specific employee segments and the personas within them, and that they're really aligned to the needs, the differing needs of those different groups. I think the other thing that's crucially important in planning a digital transformation is to remember that, if you're transitioning a business with technology at the center, it actually requires a shift in culture. And therefore, part of your plan, you have to think about how are you going to address mindsets, people, and processes, and not just focus solely on the technologies you may or may be introduced. And I think many organizations often get it wrong because they do just that. Right? They just focus on the technology, forget about the mindsets, etc. 3 key ingredients, Chris, if you'll indulge me, that I think, actually get these things to come together well. As I said, the mindset of the organization has to change. You're going to get this thing wrong if you don't couple it with a mindset change in your organization. We know people are resistant to change, and therefore it's not easy to get them to adopt new approaches, right? Now, when you're introducing technology, that's heightened because people are scared it's going to steal my job and all of that sort of stuff. So that digital transformation journey is even harder. So you've got to be conscious and put enough effort into your change management. Otherwise, you're likely to fail because people are going to be resistant. I think the second thing is around skills, right? Skills is a new currency, as we know. And the reality is that digital transformation does require employees to have new skills. we mustn't pretend that we can just, or assume that we can just, our employees will all just adopt digital ways of working, because often that just isn't my experience. I've been burned by that a few times. That's just not true. Then we need to make sure we upskill our workforces to be comfortable in the new digital paradigms. I think the last thing, and again, it gets overlooked, you've got to reimagine your processes, right? Because you cannot just introduce technology and think that that's now going to fix everything for you. You've got to relook your processes through the lens of that employee experience. And make sure, don't fall into the trap that I've done a few times in the past. You try to digitalize before you've optimized the process, because the reality is, you end up, if you had a manual process that was inefficient, crappy experience, etc., you just transferring that to a digital crappy process and experience. So spend the time to redesign the processes, and I think get the mindset right. You're on to a winning ticket.
There's a lot of nodding there on Joseph on the panel when you said I've made those mistakes before, and there's a lot of nodding on the panel from everyone else. Love to hear from everyone else. Feel free to jump in, everyone.
I think I know I have to admit I listened to everything that Joseph was saying, and it's so interesting because I feel like when I work with a lot of customers around the world, around industries, and we're all challenged with the same thing, recognizing that there are new ways of doing work and new ways of enabling people to do work. And so throwing just technology solutions is absolutely right, not the answer. It's really understanding what that new definition of work is and how you're going to enable your workforce, your new workforce, and in some cases, a younger, inexperienced workforce to support that success in work and that new definition. So everything that Joseph was saying it was resonating with me so much, because I feel like it's this challenge that every organization is faced with today.
It's really difficult to disagree with Joseph, but I like the special part about this changing mindset. It's not so obvious, but I think the change is inevitable. And if we do not change our mindset, if we do not switch into digitalization for the future, simply those companies stay behind and they will die. There is no other way than to go on digital world.
Yeah, well, we saw that in the last 2 years, didn't we? There's companies that hadn't, or those companies that had already gone through or were going through a digital transformation, kind of many of them thrived actually in the last 2 years, and others who didn't, some of them used the opportunity to do so, but many of them went out of business. We saw as well, and in fact, my company was one of those that was close to going out of business because we weren't a digital organization. We're doing now virtually with you all here, but for all that, it was very much on paper, physical, in person, both as a business, but also our product was in-person events. So we had to kind of go through a digital transformation very fast in order to get to where we are now. What about yourself, Paul? Because obviously you're going through this process right now at DAZN. I think. What are you experiencing?
I mean, I think I'd probably build on Joseph's last point at the end there about, when you are going through digital transformation, not just looking to transition one experience into a new environment, but really, taking the opportunity to look at, what opportunities do new technologies open up? What opportunities do new ways of working and new mindsets open up for us? And that's where, if we're modern and if we're progressive, rather than just saying, this is the way that we've done stuff, or the way that we do stuff, here is a new technology which lets us do things a little bit better. Great, we transition across and we get like 10% extra benefits. It's actually a chance to step back and say, well, hold on a minute, rather than just rolling straight into transitioning stuff, we look at what are we even trying to achieve within our business? What are we trying to achieve by how we look after our people, how we create a great environment for our people? What do we used to do? What have we got in terms of capabilities and new environment? And then it's almost like looking at it and saying, actually, if we were to build from scratch, like, what would we do? We're at such a sort of tipping point with like the vastness of the opportunity open to us in terms of shaping employee experiences in the future. I think it's that last bit about don't just transition what you've got. Take the opportunity to like, I know it's a cliche, right? But take the opportunity to hit the pause button, look at what you want to achieve for your people and what you want your people to achieve for you, and then set about how do we build a great environment for that in this new world or with the new opportunities we have. And you might transition some of the stuff that you already have, right? That might be the conclusion you come to, but let's not take that as a for granted assumption and take the opportunity to say, let's stop, let's pause, let's intentionally build what we want our new world to look like, and then let's pile into doing that with pace and at speed and involving our people and doing all the culture mindset and shifting stuff along the way.
I was going to ask though, Paul, to Joseph, but it sounded like you'd done that before, Joseph, and it backfired. Is that right? You kind of got the feeling that was the case,
yeah,
right?
I definitely have, and I think given where we are, I think Paul's spot on. We're on a cusp of a really new future, right? We don't know what it entails, so you don't want to necessarily take across everything that you've had. It's time to look at redesigning, right? Reconceptualize what is it that we're going to need to take us forward effectively. I've had that in digital transformations where we moved from one ERP system to another one, and we actually try to replicate what we had. Well, the reason we're moving is because we don't want what we had, right? We wanted something new, but we now try to get the new system to be exactly the old. Now's not the time for that. We've got to embrace the new that we're embarking on and do that holistically.
It's funny, Joseph, because we've got pretty much the same we're doing some replatforming work around in terms of our employee journey, how we digitize it, automate it, etc. And it's so easy to slip into that methodology of look at what we've currently got, how do we replicate it, then where do we build on it, rather than saying, actually, like, what do we want our employee journey to be? Like in an ideal world, if we were starting from scratch. So, it's just such an easy and natural thing to do, right?
Yeah, it's so tempting just to try and recreate it in another platform as well. But then you end up spending so much time trying to undo down the line. You kind of pay the price and end up trying to undo all of that bad work that you've done. And sometimes you're kind of just locked into that ecosystem because you haven't spent the time up front to actually figure out what is it we actually want to achieve, and then working backwards from there as well. So,
and I'd agree with all of that. I mean, it's an exciting time to work in HR because the last few years have almost been a bit of an experiment around work, around the future of work, where can work get done. And these were things that for people joining the workplace, they were actually questioning, why do we all work from offices? Why do we all work the same hours? Why do we have exactly the same patterns? Why do we contract with work in exactly the same way? And the answer was typically, well, this is just the way we've always been doing work, and it's fine. And I started my career in this way, and therefore you should as well. It's been a great experiment. I think the interesting thing is no one has all the answers, and hence these discussions are really, really helpful. Organizations that are not doing it well are ones that have been really prescriptive, rule-based, saying we know best. This is exactly the way to do your work. I think those that are adapting really well are treating it as a bit of an experiment and learning and understanding. And to kind of Joseph's point, not just going back to the same technology, but thinking about new technology that's needed. So, in terms of working from home, then thinking about what's the right collaboration tools, and also rethinking the office. What are their offices for? Why do we need to go in the office? Actually, they can be really, really critical if they're set up in the right way. If we have digitally enabled tools in the office that really help us collaborate, they can be fantastic ways for us to be brought together on ideas, be more creative. But these things really didn't exist perhaps pre-pandemic. So it's been really, really helpful. I think when we use the word experiment as well, organizations are using the data around this really, really well and having to get a handle on that data. So what type of collaboration works for what type of work? People, organizations are studying it. We've seen some great research from Microsoft around this. What right type of platforms for what type of work, where does that need to actually happen? And then what are some of the risks around either fully working from home, working from offices, around well-being and that type of thing? we're seeing much more digital tools and analytics being used where they hadn't been used before. So it's a fantastic time to kind of be in HR working this stuff out. And I have to say it's really helpful, being able to see different clients work through this in very different ways.
Mark, I would tend to agree with you, but with some exception. If you are working for the business like in the construction, you have a very difficult discussions with the management team because they always tell you that you cannot build the highway or airport working remotely. And it's also difficult to disagree with them.
Well, obviously, in different organizations, it's going to be different as well. And we have to understand that there will be a different type of employee experience for those that are working in factories, on the product line, etc., or in construction versus those that are office-based. And I think it's just important just to communicate that effectively internally to those organizations of what that will mean. I think companies have just done not been great at distinguishing those and sharing communication, saying, great, we're doing all of these benefits and this is the experience for in-office workers without actually taking into consideration those that aren't. I think that's where we've got to be careful about distinguishing both. And it is going to be a challenge. I'm interested to know from you, Mark, because a few people in the chat mentioned around like, where do you start? And you've just started this new role, Mark. Congratulations, by the way, at Capgemini. So when you came in, how do you decide where to focus your time and attention regarding employee experience?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it does come up a lot because I think it's a new topic. I think the playbook hasn't been perfectly written on this. That makes it exciting. That makes these debates really interesting because no one can come into it thinking they've got all the answers. You might have the answer for your type of sector, but as others have mentioned, for sectors with large blue collar workers working in the field, that might just not apply. So you've got to start there. What is it for you as a business you're trying to achieve? So we'll support clients. Employee experience now is being wedded to the business strategy, and as we said at the kind of start of the call, potentially businesses will fail if they don't do that. If they say we're going to have a new strategy, we're going to forget about the employees for a good 6 months, and then we'll work out the culture and the tools that are needed later on. We'll leave that for later. We just need to know how much profit do we need to achieve this year, or how we're going to meet those targets. That doesn't really work anymore. That doesn't work in a really talent scarce market where people now know that their value in the market can move between organizations much quicker, and where certain skills are really, really difficult to attract. So that type of thinking doesn't work. So I'd say number one is, start with the strategy. I think two is then start with business problems that are the largest, where leaders are actually saying to you, we need to do something about this. About potentially they're losing a lot of their workforce, or they've got skills that are really hard to attract. So we find that with clients perhaps in around data, digital type skills. Start in those places because you're going to have the biggest bang for your buck in those areas. You can have the biggest impact, and start relatively small so you can get your hands around that problem, that workforce, and do treat it as somewhat of an experiment. I think organizations who say we already know the answer, you're all going back to the office on Tuesday and we don't care if you don't like it, that has backfired, and there's many kind of headlines around where that's backfiring, and it doesn't really do the brand image a lot of good. So start with, we're going to experiment, and potentially that means dividing the workforce slightly and looking at different types of employee experience that you can do. I think there's then practical things that can happen. So tools and systems are still really, really important to this. But the difference now is, rather than focusing just on the process that the tool gives you, it's kind of mapping out that journey, people would say. So taking part of an employee journey. So really simplistically, onboarding, for example, and thinking through the steps, the normal steps someone's going through when they're joining an organization, and really, really simply thinking about and working with employees to understand what are the things that really matter to you during all those steps, and what are the things that are really painful. using a bit of technology to try and eliminate that is quite a simple way of doing it. And then also thinking, because we've done that, how do we then change culture and capability? But to answer your question, culture and capability is probably the most difficult. So I'm not sure I would necessarily start there, but I would just know that it needs to happen. And I would factor that heavily into the plans, which mean you can't just make these changes and hope for the best. There'll need to be some, new leadership behaviors. There'll need to be manager behaviors. There'll need to be, new knowledge about why we're doing this and capability to really drive it.
Mm-hmm.
There's something I build on that with as well, Mark, around, when you're looking at the first things to do around employee experience, I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well, is around increasing people's understanding and setting expectation. So it's very easy for all of us to talk about employee experience, the benefits it brings, et cetera, and how we go about creating our strategies, whilst forgetting that for many people, it's a buzzword. They'll see it as synonymous with employee engagement. You'll suddenly get people running off creating EX working groups that are actually just focusing on some sticky plaster engagement exercises and really creating that understanding both within the wider business and at a senior level of what do we actually mean by EX? Where does it play? What does it own? Who are the stakeholders that are involved that have really key roles in helping us develop a great employee experience? How does it roll into customer? All of those kind of things. That setting expectation about what we mean and what we're here to do and how it links to business strategy. But then also the bit you mentioned about starting small. Again, I build on that slightly by absolutely start small because you got to, and some stuff takes loads of time, but also setting people's understanding around a lot of the work we do with an employee experience is by its nature going to be iterative. So taking your example of the onboarding journey, right? You're going to make a bunch of improvements to it, but we're not going to make improvements over 12 weeks and then stand back and go, ta-da, our employee onboarding journey is fixed, it's perfect. We're like, right, okay, it's done. We can now segment that by audience and change it slightly for our teams in Croatia versus our teams in Azerbaijan. And we're going to be like, right, actually, we know that for our tech audiences, XYZ is more important in the onboarding journey, or we can start to build it out back further into pre-boarding and pre-hire, and getting that understanding that it is a never-ending iterative process as well. I think is an important piece.
I think it's really important. I think expectations around this and clarity is really important. You're right. Employee experience has become a buzzword, almost to the point where it means everything. It means absolutely anything that touches the employee. And then you think, well, how can we possibly make a change on that? So I think being clear on what it is, and then secondly, being clear on how it gets measured, because you've got thousands of KPIs in a business, and people will go around thinking, my job is to impact those KPIs. Just be really clear what is that KPI and how do I improve it. That's actually quite difficult with experience. It does need to happen. It's absolutely critical for it to be taken seriously. So I'll give you an example that in my last organization, I think this was the pivotal moment. We made ENPS as a metric, a business metric, which meant every single leader and line manager had that written into their objectives, had that written into their bonus plans, payouts, and then it started to matter. And then people said, I don't know what this ENPS is or means, but I know I've got to improve it. Can you tell me exactly how to improve that? And we had a series of measures that went across all of the different journeys, and then all of the different areas of kind of traditional engagement, like being a good line manager, being visible, being clear on the vision, being clear on objectives, all of that traditional stuff. People started to care about it. So it is important that it's not treated as a kind of nice to have and something in the background. This has got to be a business metric that the entire business is finding important, and as if it's anything else, an outcome like anything else, profit, revenue, and anything else a business is trying to drive towards, that really drives the change. And we found that work really, really well.
Mark, could you explain for a second, just to those in the chat that don't know what ENPS is?
Yeah, well, to go through the whole system, it might take a while, but it's basically employee net promoter score. And all I'd say about that score is it should be done as part of a kind of net promoter system. What it effectively means is you ask people a question from 0 to 10, and you work out on that question. So basically, would you recommend the organization to someone else? You're working out, would people advocate for the organization? So it's not actually necessarily experience, it's kind of the collection of experience. It's not necessarily engagement either, but it does work out, would your workforce recommend this place as a place where it's really quite actionable? And then you segment the answers into detractors and promoters and neutrals. That's really helpful, because then it becomes really actionable, because you can say, okay, we've got these people who are detractors. They're actually saying they wouldn't recommend. They're going out internally, externally saying, this is not a great place to work. That is naturally going to have an impact on retention, brand image, business metrics. And you can segment employees in the workforce saying, why is that? What is it that they're perhaps having a bad experience on? Why are they not engaged in the vision? So it for me, it works very well because it's a very practical measure. I think there is a debate on just how scientifically proven it is, but if at the end of the day it drives the right decisions and it drives better experience, it's really, really helpful. And happy to talk offline about how to kind of implement it and all that kind of stuff.
Thanks for explaining it. There's a lot of people in the chat that were like, there's even more questions now. We'll have to take that offline.
Sure.
A whole nother session around that. And yeah, I think yourself and Paul, did that answer your question that you was asking, Mark?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. One of the things that I picked up on, like here now, every day I do the HR Leaders podcast, and constantly comes up that if you don't do that work ahead of time that you were describing, Paul, and building the relationships internally, setting expectations, etc., by the time you come to actually implement the technology piece, it just falls flat on its face. If you don't have the relationships built in the organization, you don't have that connected tissue with the leadership team to help you drive it, and then you all of a sudden go, yeah, we've implemented this new solution, you're going to fail very, very fast.
Can I just add Chris, because I think that it may have been Mark that mentioned there. I think you've got to be very clear, especially to senior leaders, right? What are they going to get as the outcome? And because I think that's where we sometimes trip up, because we go and try to sell something and we're not crystal clear on this is actually its primary purpose. Are you trying to reduce noise, right? So there's lots of noise about onboarding or your hiring process. Is that what we're trying to fix in terms of what we are focusing on this in the experience? Are we trying to create a competitive advantage for ourselves? And that may look different, just so that you really manage their expectations, so that when you say, okay, we're done, you can remind them, remember, this is what we were trying to achieve, and that's why we can tick that we've been successful. Because they will always be looking for, but you haven't completely shifted the dial, and we can't see all of the value rolling to bottom line, etc. So you've got to contain expectations around what you're giving at what points in time with which initiative.
And one thing I'd add to that is it helps if you use the language that already exists in the organization. So it can be easier if your organization has a big push around customer experience or consumer experience, because then you can talk in the same language and you could even set up the same metrics. Often to do that, you're also creating those kind of brand principles about the experience that you want. You're chopping up that experience perhaps into journeys, you're measuring it in the same way. That's really helpful. But to come in with totally new language that might be used in HR circles, but the business doesn't understand, you're going to find it very difficult to then convince people about this and exactly what it is.
And I think precisely to that point, employee experience is really breaking down the barriers across the business, right? HR is not working on it on its own. It's not just HR's responsibility to manage and excel and really define how they're going to support that future of work. To everybody's point, it's impacting the bottom line. It is in every business leader's interest. And HR is a huge part of making not just the recommendations, but truly taking that leadership role as an innovation leader as a result of the technologies that they're enabled to support for that future of work. So I think it's really breaking down a lot of those barriers across the silos, across the business, to ensure that we're, in fact, HR is working with the customer success folks, right? To really be able to leverage the experience opportunities that they've been able to maximize for their employee population, and how they can really redefine what expectations are for the employees. I mean, I think there's brand new expectations that employees are putting in place in order to ensure that they stay with the company, ensure that they stay that employer of choice. The employees are now the ones that are driving that new expectation. So
definitely, Nancy. I'm interested to know, someone mentioned it in the chat about like the relationship between yourselves and your HR teams. What does that look like, Paul? The relationship between your HR team and the work that you do, what does that relationship look like? What kind of structure or decision-making process do you have in place?
I'd hope it's pretty good, because we're part of the HR team. So if it's not good, then we're in trouble. No, on a serious note, so our model is we're a people team. And I think what we've probably done is we have a number of HR partners who work directly with obviously with different parts of the business, doing a sort of more traditional generalist HR role, partnering into different functions. We have some of our shared service teams who sit centrally. And then I think our model is around bringing together several of the traditional HR centers of expertise, COEs, to come together to form that employee experience team, coupled together with some of the employee insight and understanding stuff that Joseph was talking about earlier. So the way that we operate and we try to build the relationship and keep it going actually plays to a lot of what Nancy was saying about breaking down barriers and having responsibility sit locally with local teams, with individuals, because the actual like realization of your employee experience comes in the individual interactions you have with your colleagues, with your line managers, with the processes within your business, how your policies are executed, what your systems are and how they operate. And like HR cannot and does not own all of those experiences, or it does not pull the levers on all of those systems. But what we can do is we can work really closely as leaders, as centers of expertise with the teams, whether they're within the wider HR team or whether they're out within the business, on how do we continually improve all of those things. The stuff I was saying about our replatforming of ServiceNow earlier is a great example, right? We're working with our business systems team, with our HR shared services team, bringing everybody together around, okay, it might sit from a day-to-day perspective with our global shared services team in terms of day-to-day activity within like the new ServiceNow. It might be our business systems team that run the back end and will do the actual build of processes and how that digital employee experience comes to life. And it might be us who provide counsel and input on what makes up a great employee experience and how do we do things like making sure we're not just transitioning an old practice into a new digital environment. But everybody has to come together in order to create that in a sensible and modern way. And then as it gets created, we all have to be able to step back and accept that it's people and it's local that actually have those experiences come to life. So how we work together, I see us as very much a central with a small c, a central function that is very much about expertise, education, opening up opportunity, helping people discover new ways of working, trying to be progressive, and trying to, rather than spinning all the plates ourselves, kind of like sharing out the plates so that they can be spun in different parts of the business. I'm not sure if that's too weird an analogy or not.
I think we all got it, Paul. Now, I asked that because there's certain companies I'm speaking to now that the employee experience function doesn't even sit under HR. I'm seeing that in a number of companies now. And there's many reasons, the positives and negatives to doing so as well. So I just wanted to ask you that question, because traditionally we're seeing it does sit under the HR umbrella, but I'm seeing a number of roles that are being created and leaders that I spoke to recently who actually operate report directly into the business as opposed to HR.
Yeah, I'm not too sure how much it matters, as long as you have leadership that buy into the idea of what employee experience is and why it's important that we improve it. I think it's very similar to something like internal comms, right? That you can plug that into an office of the CEO, you can have it sit within HR, you can have it sit within your marketing or a wider comms team, and there are pros and cons to each of those setups. But the key thing in any instance is understanding what benefit is this function trying to bring for your business, and are your leadership aligned on what that benefit is and how we go about putting it into place. Then once you've got those things sorted, it becomes all about stakeholder relationships, how you actually implement work, where you target your efforts and your resource, and how you communicate about the benefits that you're bringing so that people understand the work.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, Joseph, because your role, you're Group Head of Employee Experience and Chief Operating Officer of HR. Explain a bit more about that and that role.
Yeah, so I do also sit within people and culture, as we call HR. We're not into human resources, we're into people. So I guess there's a few components to my role. So Paul mentioned, he has a global shared services component, so I have that sitting with me. I've got our people analytics capability sitting with me. We don't have HR technology sitting with our IT team, so that sits with me in the function. People advisory, all of that sort of stuff. So it's quite broad, as well as looking after financial management, etc., for the function across the group. And there's one thing I wanted to maybe mention, Chris, which isn't so much about structure, but I think as HR, we need to make sure that we are also working on ourselves, right? Because as we do these transformations, we also have to be changing. And, I think there isn't enough time spent on making sure that we are also ready to be able to properly, fully enable the business, right? So there's work we have to do in HR, some of which we've done in ABSA. We absolutely have moved away from, we are not a control function, right? We're not about just ensuring compliance with labor law policies and standards and all of that. We are enablers to the business. So making sure that we get that right. And are we transforming ourselves? Do we understand the digital stuff? Can we use the systems, etc., that we put out? We've got to make sure that the function has been transformed as well. I think the other one is, I mentioned earlier, skills is the new currency, right? So the old traditional skills that we had in HR, they also need to evolve, right? We need design thinking. We've got to have the right digital skills in the function, strategic workforce planning, etc., right? Otherwise, we're not going to properly enable the business. So if we don't also pivot ourselves, this thing is also not going to work. Hey, whether it sits in HR or elsewhere, the key is that wherever it sits, you're facilitating this thing, right? You don't have complete carte blanche over it. You've got to do this with others. Otherwise, it's never going to work. You're never going to succeed. So it is about getting that collaboration right, etc. But we've also got to upskill ourselves, because the old HR that we know, that's not what businesses need today. So are we meeting the new requirements of us?
Mm-hmm. Cezary, I saw you nodding your head. I like doing that. What's been the key for you would say, in terms of how you've managed to constantly disrupt yourself and upskill your own personal skill set? What is there any particular thing that's worked for you better over the years?
I would say like this, to Joseph's point, that first of all, if you want to transform or make any transformation together with the business, we need to be also flexible, open to change ourselves. In our case, that's quite interesting combination, as HR is linked with the innovations. And we are mainly working with the startups on the strategy that could complement the overall company strategy. And we are looking for the solutions that are not present now as a product or service in the company. We are trying to think as a HR or support business to think new projects, new ideas. So this is rather more even like product development or BD activities or something like this. So it requires from us a being constantly open for new ideas, for new systems, for what's going on within the business, or even thinking one step ahead. So this is very intellectual game. And also in terms of organization, we have quite similar model like Mark mentioned, that we have HR business partners, center of expertise and entire administration outsourced to the third companies. But I think the key here in this puzzle is the role of the HR business partners who are very close to the business, who speaks the business language and who should know the business, who should support the people. If I can say it this way.
It makes sense, Cezary. You are one of the first chief HR and innovation officers I came across. And the fact that the business understand the value of the people, that they've put that with you, and understanding that aligning HR and people with innovation was something which is, I've not seen many companies focus their attention on, which was great to see.
Even saying more, in the history of this company, 90% cases, only HR directors became CEOs. Despite that this is purely engineering company.
Really?
Really,
Wow.
the concept behind this was that we can learn engineering, but we cannot learn how people behave. Those
You can learn it, but it's tough. That's incredible. So you say 90% of the CEOs have come from the HR team. Wow. Yeah. Okay. And especially within your industry, that's even more less heard of within the construction. From my experience as well. Wow. One of the things that I wanted to speak about, and I'll come to you, Mark, on this. We've been saying the future of work as a buzzword for a long time. I think after the last 2 years, when we talk about the future of work, it kind of means something completely different after the last 2 years we've had. So what do you see now is that next sort of North Star is in terms of how we define the future of work and employee experience, and what that will mean?
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, this one. I mean, firstly, like I said at the start, I think we've caught up with, we were basically working in a first industrial revolution style of working, almost as if we were in factories. You know, people were working 9 to 5 and in the same offices in the same style, even if, you know, their work was completely unrelated to that. So over the last 2 to 3 years, we've kind of caught up. I think as others have said at the start, culture capability hasn't really caught up with that. So we're still needing to build the culture capability around whether it's hybrid working, whether it's new ways of working, so kind of more agile teams, project teams. That will be something over the next 2, even up to 5 years, that organizations will become more flexible in the way that they work. That, you know, systems will help, but lots of that is around culture capability and different ways of working. I think Joseph's point is a really interesting one about skills as a new currency. You know, we're seeing that organizations are treating work differently, and that's a bit of the revolution that's happening. You know, permanent roles with job descriptions of this is exactly what you're going to be doing for the next 10 years. That's not really sustainable, because skills need to change, the type of work needs to change. Work is being automated all the time or augmented by technology. So we're seeing work being chopped up in different ways. That's very interesting for the HR function. I think the challenge is when you try to deliver that, the systems often don't help. You know, there's not often the systems to store good skills or update that on time. You can certainly find them, and you can find them with startups, or there's not really the culture of sharing resources. So that's going to be a big part of the future, where, yeah, this question of who owns employee experience, which function does that sit in? You'd hope that will be a question of the past. You'd hope that project teams will work on this perhaps in journeys, and you'd hope that that will be something that will be in the past. I think the last one is we're going to care about, obviously, employees still, but we're going to care about, you know, wider workforce of contractors and that sort of thing. And we're also going to care a little bit more deeply about well-being, because we've noticed that in the pandemic, how critical that is for businesses. And I think we're going to bring a lot more data and understanding about that, the importance of that, and really keeping a very sustainable workforce.
Yeah, I feel like I just opened up Pandora's box there, and we have to wrap up. So I saw this, like, that's a whole other panel we just started there, right? I saw Joseph nodding away, and Nancy and everyone was like, yes, this is a great topic to get into. As well, and now I'm being told in my ear that I've got to go. So